Hey everybody, welcome to the first of our workshop series videos. In this video, we're going to be talking about some of the changes we've made to modeling on a provider map model on an endpoint. We're also going to be talking about the new features that we have implemented on the developer portal, which is this page right here. So in general, in the workshop videos, what you can expect to see is some more clarification, some more information about some perhaps more esoteric features that you would otherwise have to dig through the documentation to find, as compared to the intro videos, which are a baseline introduction to the features and usefulness of the API Toolbox in general. So usually whenever we come out with a new feature or someone has a particularly interesting question that we want to answer and share with everybody, we'll put out one of these videos and hopefully make it clear to everybody some of the things you can do. So first things first, what we're going to be doing is looking at a provider map, talking about the new features we added to modeling. They're not particularly complicated, but they do allow you to do some new things. And just as a refresher, we're going to take a look at the data provider that we've been using for a lot of our demos. We're actually only going to be using the post collection, the post resource. So you can see the data here. There's like 100 something posts in here, but it doesn't really matter. We're just going to be working with just one, really. So the data that's available is the user ID, the title, and the body. So what we've already talked about before with modeling is, let's say we wanted to get rid of a field. Well, we could do that with modeling before. Why would we want to get rid of a field? Well, if we're pulling data into a phone app or a process with relatively low memory availability, we want to filter that for you so that you don't have to have that bogging down your system. Also, if we wanted to parse a particular field in a particular way, the example we gave before is an email field parses an email, then we can use those properties and pass them forward in relationships, things like that. If you want more information on those, there's already a video on it, first of all, but second of all, we'll probably cover that in future workshop videos. So what's new about the modeling that's different from what you may have already seen? Well, we've approached this, we felt that you should be able to define a data interface. What do we mean by a data interface? If you have a interface in an application, essentially what it means is that you define a set of functions or a single function that accepts a certain number of arguments of a certain type and returns a value of a certain type. And you basically define this communication more so than actually implementing the code that does it. Then you have implementations of that interface which actually implement it, right? So you can think of a data interface in the context of the API Toolbox as maybe something that we want to build an application around. So we expect data coming from a certain endpoint to be of a certain format. The problem is, what happens if the data that we want to treat abstractly coming from provider A is different from that coming from provider B? So maybe one provider has messages, another one has updates, and we want to treat both of those as messages, right? Well, what we might do is define a messages endpoint on both of those provider maps. But if the data is structured differently, we want to coerce it into a standard format, right? So we couldn't do that before. We've taken steps to allow you to do that more so now. So we want to demonstrate those features and then touch on some usability updates we made to the UI. Okay, so let's dive right into the source code of this provider map. It's just a demo account. These provider maps over here we're not going to touch on. So we're just dealing with this right here. We're going to jump right into the source code here. The internet's a little bit slow in this room, so bear with me here if this is a little bit laggy. So this has a single endpoint. This provider map has a single endpoint posts, which maps to /posts, as we talked about on this data provider right here. And we have our model that we've already defined, which has the fields ID, user ID, and title. So we filtered the body. Nothing new there, right? So what happens if our data interface, we don't want to use camel case fields here, field names? What we can do now, we couldn't do this before, but we can do it now, is name this whatever we want. So before, what it would do is, based on the name you gave it, it would pull off the data, pull off the field with that name in the raw data, and then parse it. And if you didn't include it, it wouldn't include it in the data, right? So if you didn't have a field, that's a way to essentially whitelist the data that you want. So now what we do, remember this string here is just shorthand for type. So what we're going to have to do is blow that out to an object, much like related fields, stuff like that, right? This is going to be type integer. And the new thing that we've added here is source. And this is going to be user ID because that's the actual value in the data provider, which is camel cased. So this essentially lets us rename fields, right? So if we save this and then go ahead and make some calls over in Postman, what do we get? Well, you can see here we have the ID, we have the user ID in the underscore format, and we have the title. Okay, so that's one of the things. What happens if you have a data provider that returns data for a field and another data provider doesn't, and you're trying to normalize those to an interface? Well, before, you would have to, in your application, check to see whether or not various fields existed. We felt that was a little annoying. So what we changed is, if you specify the field and it isn't in the data, it returns null. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the fields here. What we're going to do is add another one. Let's call it nothing to be clever, I guess. And it's just going to be a string, but it doesn't really matter because it's not there in this data provider. And then we go ahead and save that and then make a call here. And as we might expect, there's nothing and it's null. Okay. The final thing that we changed on the model parsing, you might already see evidence of it here. And this worked in certain cases before, and it didn't work in others. So we just normalized how that behaved. And that is the order of these fields is returned in the order that you specify them. Okay, so it's not particularly useful if you're dealing with things like a program, right? Because the ID is the ID, it doesn't care where it is. But if you're doing tests and manual test cases and stuff like that, and you just want to see that data in a particular format, there you go, right? So just to demonstrate that, we're going to take this and move the ID last here, and then save this. Then we're going to make one final call, and there you go, the ID is last. Okay, great. So those are the updates to the model parsing. Nothing too groundbreaking, but it does cover some edge cases that we encountered, some of our users encountered. They gave us feedback and said, hey, can you please do this? And there you go, it's working now. So you should be good to go on that front. So now let's talk about the usability changes that we did to the portal. You probably noticed this as I was clicking through it. One of the big ones is we changed the detail page. The old detail page was pretty bad. And it was always sort of intended as a placeholder. So what we did is iterated on it and made it a little bit more useful, included some stuff to help you visualize stuff at a glance without having to dive through the source code, stuff like that. So a lot of the cursory details that were on the old page are just replicated up here, up top. So the ID, the version, stuff like that, right? The description, if you set a description on the provider map, it sets it off in its own section there. Hopefully that will let you differentiate between various provider maps, especially those that might share the same data provider that you're using for different circumstances. If not, then the description's still there if you need it. Aside from that, it's the endpoints. We have a way to visualize these. So we have a single endpoint post, which we saw in the source code, and it supports a single verb. If you do multi-verb support on these endpoints, then what you get is multiple little things that go across there. So get, post, patch, put, stuff like that. So all the verbs that are supported on that endpoint are listed there. Okay, and then some basic instructions about how you call it. The other thing we've done is added Postman export, essentially. So it's a little bit easier to get the calls out of this system into Postman to test this out. So what we did, you didn't notice it down here because I already had this included, but if I were to delete this collection and go ahead and delete this call right there, and then we download this, okay? So we download the JSON file, then we hop back over to our Postman, there's no collections here, so what we're going to do is import this. We're going to import a file, choose the file Postman that we downloaded, okay, open that up, and you can see here that it is re-imported. One thing of note here is if you go to the single route, what we could have done is made this identifier a variable, but we figured it'd be a little annoying because what you'd have to do is then have the identifier up in the environment. And also if you have multiple endpoints or multiple collections, it would conflict. So if you want to call this thing with an identifier of 2, just delete the 1 and put a 2, right? So there you go. So you have a call for that post, and you have a call for the list. Okay. The final thing that we did here is went ahead and updated this. So we have our provider map library that we have curated. A lot of these, we wrote a lot of these from scratch. A lot of them are from other projects that we worked on, some things that people requested. So there's just a lot of data providers in here. You can see the list if you go to that page yourself. So what we're going to do is talk about how these more easily integrate with the API Toolbox now. First, a side note, some of these are more complete than others, and some of these we personally have more expertise in than others. So if you need something changed, want something changed, if we mess something up, please feel free to submit a pull request, and then we'll work with you to iron that out, get that integrated. It should be a pretty straightforward process. Okay? So they're organized by data provider. So let's go ahead and open the one for GitHub. So you can see here that we do have the source included in here. So if you were to go in, you could copy and paste that if you wanted. That you could always do. So if we went in here and did created a provider map, a new one, I'd have this information here. It's just a blank provider map rather. And we could go over here, copy all that stuff and paste it in there. I thought that was just a little bit too cumbersome. Copy and paste is very easy, but having one clicks is always nice where possible. So we went ahead and did that. So if you go in here and then we do add to API Toolbox, it pulls that in for you. You have now a provider map that maps to GitHub and is fully validated and it works. I'll draw your attention to a few of these things. We did parse some of these from documentation programmatically, so you might need to change a couple of those names, stuff like that, or delete endpoints that aren't relevant to your use case, things like that. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up what we had for this workshop video. We'll be pushing out more of these in the coming days, touching on a few other features, and then of course, as I mentioned, if we push out something that's particularly interesting or come across a question that demands clarification, this is the channel for that. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you got any questions, let us know. Other than that, thanks for joining us and have a great day.